Welcome back to the 100 Stories. I'm Bruce Scates, and it was my immense privilege to lead the 100 Stories project here at Monash University. And I'm joined by
Margaret Harris. I'm your course mentor for this run of the course.
Margaret. So much more than a course mentor. The work that she's doing in her PhD is really blazing new fields in how we remember the Great War, and it's terrific to have these early career researchers like Margaret, like Bec, like Laura involved in this project.
Thank you, Bruce.
First of all, can I say thank you to you too. We are very conscious that this medium really engages us in a worldwide conversation. And when you think about the Great War, it's something that wasn't confined simply to Australia or to any individual nation that was involved in it. It was a transnational disaster, and it's fantastic that from all across the world we've got learners like yourselves engaging in a conversation about the impact of that war and how we remember that war right up to today.
So, I'm going to start the questions now. I'm acting as your voice, so hopefully I'm asking the right questions. We had some discussion about how this course is laid out and about what this project is. Could you expand on how you came to do it and what you would have expanded if you'd had the chance?
The project originally emerged out of the Anzac Centenary Board, which was set up by the Australian government to discuss how we should actually mark the centenary of the Great War. And of course there were many very worthy projects that were fielded by the community. Here at Monash, we felt it very, very important that we recover the other side of the story. I think so often in Australia, because Anzac is part of a nation-building narrative, we forget the real tragedy that war visited upon this young nation back then. And the reality of it is that this course set out consciously to address what we saw as an imbalance. We wanted to show the effect of shell shock. We wanted to talk about women's mobilisation. We wanted to talk about Indigenous issues, because so often those things have kind of slid out of the historical prism. So if the course seems like it's slanted in one particular way, it's actually because it's there addressing an imbalance in the historiography.
One of the things that learners really liked to talk about in the comments, there were some excellent comments, thank you very much, was about masculinity in war and about the performance of grief and about how men dealt with loss. Could you expand on that comment?
There's actually some wonderful work that's been done on this recently by in Britain, Mike Roper, who joined us in the very first week of the course. He was looking at the construction of masculinity and how soldiers in the field dealt with their grief. Here in Australia, we've got Joy DeMusi, who's written a very good book called Labour of Loss. And one of the things that she does in that book is look at how men recorded their loss, the loss of their mates in their diaries, their letters, their journals. And what we often find is that men have to repress their grief. You simply can't afford to express that grief because there is so much death, so much loss all around you. So you actually have this kind of stoicism that emerges out of the Great War. But there's something very interesting about that. Sometimes that stoicism breaks down. Sometimes men can't maintain that strong, firm, masculine persona. And I guess we allude to that in the 100 Stories project with the story of Knox, who very much expresses the grief he feels for his men in the field. Now, Knox, of course, is an officer. He has to remain in control, in command. He has to inspire confidence in those around him. And yet he is devastated by the loss of, as he puts it, his boys. And we often have that paternal language actually being a filter through which men express their grief.
Certainly, and I think another of the stories is a father who is trying to deal with the loss of his son, and those kinds of stories, that paternalistic. I think it's one of the frames where men can acceptably talk about grief.
Yes, I just find the Roberts story so eloquent, and I hope it's touched you too. Here in Melbourne, the Melbourne Museum actually has an exhibition of the Roberts family's records, and that little booty, that fragile little booty that was sent to that man overseas, linking him with a daughter that he never actually saw, is part of that exhibition. And of course Roberts, in his own personal diary, records every day the loss of his son, imagining where he would be now had he survived. It's a compelling story, I think, and we're very fortunate that we have these records here in Australia and elsewhere in the world that articulate that loss.
Onto a slightly happier topic. we were also talking about war memorials and about all of the different things that you can use a war memorial for. And I was trying to explain how they were overdetermined, so that there were lots of different things. But I think there was some resistance to the idea that they were political objects. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit for our learners on how war memorials and politics kind of interacted.
They do interact, and it's a really complex relationship, isn't it? Most memorials in Australia were raised by public subscription, and this represents an enormous investment by the community. So when we say they're political, we're not saying that the government decreed what people should build and provided the funds to build it, not at all. But we are saying that often people lapsed into a language that would be familiar, that would be comforting, that would reconcile them to their grief. So when we look at memorials and we see that phrase, the glorious dead, it's saying that sacrifice wasn't pointless, it wasn't in vain. It is to rationalise the terrible loss of the Great War, and as such it must be seen through a political prism. Now sometimes it's quite overtly political. A good case of this, Margaret, I guess, is our own great memorial, the Shrine of Remembrance here in Melbourne. It's probably the largest war memorial in the world. It's certainly one of the most expensive. I think it was over £200,000 to build, an enormous amount of money. And there you have powerful lobby groups saying what shape that memorial will take. And you actually have enormous popular opposition to the memorial. Why? Because that generation in the 1920s were living with the blind, the crippled, the insane who came back from that war. And many of them felt, well, what's the greatest tribute we could pay to the men who lost their lives and who suffered so much? It's to look after the men and women who came back from that war. So that utilitarian dimension actually ran against the monumental version of the war memorial that we end up with on the Shrine domain of Remembrance here in Melbourne. So you can see how the politics has played out. But I'm not for a moment, and I know you're not either, Margaret, in the work that you're doing now on both Aotearoa and Australia, underestimating the huge community investment in this and the way that people struggled to find the words to express their loss in war.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the power of grief is quite remarkable.
It is. It's devastating.
Kind of the last couple of questions are kind of a bit more fun. If you were to recommend media for our learners to watch, if you were to say to them, you know, this is a good movie, or this is a good book, or this is a good television series, what would you recommend?
Well, The Guardian's done a terrific, The Guardian in London has done a terrific documentary about the Great War. It involves several different historians. So too has the BBC. The BBC has fielded a series of interviews across the world. And the great thing about the BBC is how it reaches out well beyond Britain. So there was an episode in Sydney, there was one in India, there was one in Istanbul. And that again is a conscious recognition of the global calamity that we call the Great War. That's certainly worth listening to. Here in Australia, I was involved in the war that changed us, one of the historians involved in that. I particularly like that project because it's sort of a what do they call them? A doco-drama. So you get the talking head historian, but what really gives that program life, I think, the actors who are brilliant, but also the way that they evoke the words of the men and the women themselves. And that documentary, it's a 4-part series that was run by our ABC here in Australia. I think that's certainly worth a viewing. Later on in the course, we'll be looking at film and history. We actually interrogate The Water Diviner, that feature film about the Great War in Turkey and Australia, and we look at the historical context, if you like, of that film. So there's a great many really exciting resources out there. Every country has responded, I think, enormously creatively to the Great War. And let's not forget other forms of expression here, like the wonderful musical performances. I was privileged to hear a performance on the Somme to mark 1916 in the cathedral at Fromelles, the church at Fromelles, and that was a deeply moving experience. And here at Monash, just the other day, to pay tribute to that great historian Ken Inglis, we performed Frederick Kelly's remarkable music from the Somme, written shortly before he died.
Yeah, certainly those things I would second. Definitely Gallipoli, the first movement is really beautiful.
Yes, it is, yes. Septimus Kelly's work is quite extraordinary.
Yes. I think if I was to recommend one, I would probably recommend The Wipers Times,
Oh,
which
yes,
is
yeah.
kind of a fun movie. I like it because it never really shows the Germans as a presence. There's no real enemy. The enemy is boredom. The enemy is kind of the circumstance which makes them. It's about human triumph over misery, and I quite like that. I think that as an encapsulation of the First World War, human triumph over misery is not a bad theme to view the war through.
And it's a theme we share, regardless on what uniform you're wearing, what side of the trenches you're on.
Certainly.
And those are common parts of the experience of
Certainly.
the Great War. Yeah, too true.
So, as part of the overall course, the students this week have done a project to write an epitaph for one of the 100 stories that they felt really moved them. I think that the epitaphs have gone really well. Could you talk about the context of why we've asked to do them and kind of why this is actually a task that people back in the olden days were asked to do too?
Jay Winter talks a lot about the silence of the Great War, about how words couldn't actually express the experience of the Great War. And I've often pondered, how could you actually express your grief, your tremendous loss in those 66 letters and characters? And I guess, it's great we've got a New Zealander joining us in this Anzac course, because the New Zealanders weren't actually given that right. They were not entitled to write an epitaph. The New Zealand government argued if there was one New Zealander who couldn't afford an epitaph, and remember, you're actually charged, is it threepence halfpenny for every letter or character, then there would be some people who couldn't afford that, and therefore that would be wrong. And that was an extraordinary statement for the New Zealand government to make. I guess we should also remember those who were missing during the Great War. Families there too didn't have the chance to vent their grief through an epitaph. We were talking before about politics. I guess I should say something about the politics of this in terms of the politics of commemoration. The state decreed that bodies couldn't be repatriated home. You couldn't bring your boy home. That meant that it had to make concessions to families. It had to somehow embody the families in that memorial space overseas. So the epitaph was a way that families could exert their presence in those vast state-constructed cemeteries across the Western Front, across Turkey and so on. So it's actually a very important exercise because it's getting you to try and imagine what it was like for that generation. And that, of course, is part of the skill of a historian, to try and imagine. I mean, we never can, but to try at least to imagine what that experience was for that generation.
Certainly, I think the hardest lesson to learn during my historical training was compassion. It was one of the hardest things. You must remember the human all the time.
Yes.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for coming and speaking to my students. I know they really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Thank you for setting up the course. Is there any final things you'd like to say?
Yes, well, I'd like to again pay tribute to Margaret for the great job she's doing in monitoring this course. And I've also got some news for you. I'm delighted to say that Bec and Laura, who were the founding members of the 100 Stories project, have almost completed their PhDs. I say almost because both of them have brought into the world two beautiful children. So this is great news to all of you learners out there, and we'll look forward to seeing you again on the 100 Stories project.
Thank you.